Hi everyone, it's been a little while since we last caught up, I suppose. I can't quite remember what it was I was saying, but I'm James Martin, and well, brushing off the cobwebs, welcome to What's Left.
When I said, hey, hey, what's wrong with you? I want to turn you round, upside down, just to see you smile. You know I'm gonna be there, want to bit more.
And we're back. Welcome to What's Left. It's been a little while since our global, I think, US election special, where we were working around the world and all of this. And we've just come back from hiatus. For those of you who are eagle-eyed, you'll notice that we've just had a subtle name change from What's Left to What's Left Unsaid. And we have a new team, as with any hiatus, a new team that's joining us, as well as some familiar faces from the past. And just to introduce, for now at least, one of those familiar faces is Sean Halsall. Hi, Sean. How's things?
I'm good, James. Yeah, it's good to be back, and yeah, it's been a while, hasn't it? I was just thinking about that mammoth eight-hour episode we did around the American elections. Where hasn't that gone well?
Hasn't it just? Do you believe someone owes me £1? I know it's not you, but I think someone who thought that Trump wouldn't quite get there. Well, actually, it might have. Accounting for all of the inflation these days, that pound might be worth 20. I want to also just make a mention for some team members, panel members who couldn't be with us this evening. We're recording when it's particularly warm, and obviously that has effects on people. So Laura Brogan and Angela Morelli, who will be joining us as regular panelists. However, there is someone who you will recognise from last time, and that is George White. Hello, George.
Hiya, you all right?
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it's actually been too long, but I think it has. I think it might have been something like, a year, 2 years? Some of you have grown a lot of facial hair and visibly aged since last time, but so George, what's been going on, I suppose, since last time we spoke?
Well, I think there's been absolutely nothing happening in the world. Everything's just been on pause, waiting for us. The United States haven't witnessed actual state murders, you might want to call them. There hasn't been an elected president kidnapped and held pending trial, still pending trial, I think. And there hasn't been, the preludes to sort of global war, has there? So not much for us to catch up on, really, is there?
No, nothing much. There's certainly been nothing going on the coast of Iran either. So nothing much. How about you, Sean? While the world's been pausing, waiting for us to come back, what's been going on with you?
Yeah, so I mean, I spent earlier this year about a month in hospital watching those state-sponsored murders in America by the new brown shirts, aka ICE. It's horrifying, isn't it? How quickly we've slipped. And I mean, we've been speaking about this for a long time. I think some of the earliest episodes we were talking about the rise of fascism in Europe, and look how quickly that's going with sort of Farage and Rupert Lowe in this country and all across Europe. It's really getting quite terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. It was Barry Tomasi who was with us in our first show and reflecting what was going on in Italy. To see that ramped up and spread to many other countries since that interview has been worrying. And again, I just want to say, for those who have somehow found what's left, and want to know a little bit of our background, well, actually, What's Left started off as the People's Paper, which had been running for about 10 years. And then, well, we decided to remove ourselves from Twitter and, well, do what everyone else seems to be up to these days, though we were there first with emphasis, set up a podcast. So, just in case you've stumbled on this and are wondering what was it we just said sort of in the green room, at various stages of facial hair? Can I just say for listeners that absolutely does not apply to Angela or Laura, but for now I suppose you'll just have to take our word for it. Sean, we've lots of plans and lots of guest speakers coming up on What's Left. Can you give us a flavour of some of those guests and what listeners can expect to hear?
Yeah, some old favourites. Francisco Dominguez will be joining us again soon. He's confirmed that, and he'll be talking all things Latin America and sort of the American imperial machine operating there and in the Caribbean. It's very worrying what's going on in Cuba at the moment. So yeah, I think it's not remiss of us to send our solidarity to the people of Cuba there under absolutely savage blockades, and Venezuela as well, and what's going there on top of the earthquake that's happened, and George alluded to the kidnapping of their president. We have got very special guests, hopefully when we get a date sorted, with the former leader of the Labour Party, no longer in that party, and sort of the greatest prime minister we never had in sort of the last 20, 30 years, maybe our lifetimes. Jeremy Corbyn will be joining us soon. And that'll be really interesting to see what's going on there and what sort of vision he sees while we see the sort of current Labour Party sort of influx constantly and seemingly drowning. And we're going to reach out to Salam Sheikh as well, speak again about AI, because again, we spoke to Salam a few years ago and that was a really interesting conversation, but it's sort of moved at 100 miles an hour since then and what AI is doing, and it's sort of gone from being this fringe thing to sort of in everybody's hands and causing problems everywhere. So that'll be an interesting conversation, and many, many more as well.
And remind me, it was I think the AI creation was Furhat, is that right? With Salim?
Yeah. Furhat was the social robots he called it, wasn't it? Which is a mannequin head with a face projected onto it that you can have a real time conversation with. It was interesting talking to Salim and seeing the human aspect to it and what this could be, and we weren't just using it to make nonsense posters and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I believe from memory as well, Furhat had named itself.
I'm not sure if it was naming itself or it had been named and then it had just picked up on that at some point. But yeah, we'll have to ask Salim when he comes back on about that.
Well, it'd be good to catch up. I mean, one of the things that we'd said was we could perhaps even look at doing an interview with the machine, I suppose, and all of this. And George, I mean, I suppose some other news, perhaps in terms of a bit of a what's left. The left are accused of spinning off into other projects. I assure you this is in Unity, but there is a show that's in development, working title of Old News, actually looking at a bit of working class and other history. George, why for any listener, I suppose, why is history important to the working class?
Well, I think it's always important, if you're going to know where you're going to know where you've come from. And I think certainly one of the sort of founding principles of What's Left was the idea that people's own history is kept from them, that the working class history isn't taught in the schools. It isn't put out there on conventional media. Very little of it perhaps is put out on social media unless people are doing things like this. So it's very difficult to actually understand what perhaps your ancestors were doing 100 years ago, or people who share the same sort of conditions as you were doing. What were trade unionists doing 100 years ago, 200 years ago in Lancashire? There's been a couple of projects just recently. One about the one that was 100 years ago, which would be the general strike, and it was explaining about what was happening in Accrington at the time of the general strike, what was happening in Blackburn, and then there's also the bicentenary of the Weavers' Rising, which again you'll probably know, probably hear about things like the Luddites, and often the Luddites I think get a quite a bad rep. They're referred to quite often as just technophobes, but the Luddites were actually witnessing an entire way of life and an entire way of supporting their families disappear in front of their eyes, and their only option was to be swallowed up by the mills that were being created, and they took their only option and decided to smash the mill machines up.
Well, and it's of course, where we get the term sabotage from the old wooden clog sabot. Sorry for a bit of French history there for everyone, but it's funny you mentioned the general strike, because for lots of our listeners, and a lot of our listeners came from New Zealand, Australia. We're hopefully welcoming you back. But for those in Europe, they must be slightly bemused by the fact that in the UK, we call it the general strike, as opposed to what workers see in other countries. I have to mention France, of course, slightly biased there, but where perhaps you'll see quite a few of them in history. I mean, why do you think in Britain we have only had a general strike, or have we had more? It's just we've not called it as such.
So I would certainly argue that was it the Pentonville 5? I would argue that could very well be called a general strike, only it wasn't, and it arguably was successful in its aims, unlike the general strike. I think there have been other times when there's been sort of industry-wide strikes or multiple industry-wide strikes that could have been determined as a general strike, because I think largely even general strikes aren't universal, but I think that within Britain there's always been this sort of establishment vein that tries to keep everything stifled and keep everything from developing into that. Certainly there is within the legislative realm. It's, I think in the UK, compared to a lot of other countries, it's illegal to have a general strike. It's illegal to have political strikes. It's illegal to have secondary action, or arguably it's illegal to have secondary action. So there's quite a lot of I think it's we're the one of the harshest anti-trade union legislations in maybe Europe or maybe the Western world. So a lot of that conspires against us, doesn't it?
And I think that someone once said the reason why we ended up with Chartists and letter writing essentially is because the climate's mild. Well, certainly that's beginning to change as well. Sean, I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's important when we look back at those historic strikes, so the match women of 1888 and things like that, that they weren't operating through putting in grievances and that they took direct action, and often breaking laws and legislation there at the time. The Dublin lockout in 1913, stuff like that. I mean, workers, we've become constrained by the legislation in this country as a trade union movement, where throughout history, I mean, the Tolpuddle Martyrs has just been recently celebrated down on the south coast, and that's another instance of trade unionists actively breaking the law to try and better their own lot. I mean, we've got to remember who these laws are created to protect. It's to protect capital and to protect business interests. If it was on our side, then I'd argue that there would be zero trade union legislation or anti-trade union legislation, and we'd have the shackles removed. But maybe it's time that the trade union movement realised that they're not playing in a fair system, and time to remove those shackles again.
I think that I will get myself into trouble for saying this, but again, another shout out to the Luddites who really did pioneer the way long before the so-called Topable martyrs and all of that. And they're, again, as George was saying, often overlooked.
Yeah, and there's the sort of the strikes up in the north where people came out in support of the Charters. 1841, I think it was, around Halifax and Todmorden, around there. I mean, again, this is times when the military was put against ordinary working class people just fighting to keep a meal on the plate and a roof over their heads. And you see this state-sponsored violence every time workers start recognising the power they've got.
There's one other sort of interesting sort of reason why some of this didn't develop is because the employment contract didn't exist until after the war, and so a lot of people didn't have, other than a week's wage coming in, didn't have a stake in an employer. They were almost like, if I don't call you in, you don't get any work. So there's a sort of different mindset there from how we might see employment and collective bargaining, isn't there?
Yeah, and I talked to some of the reps about that quite a lot, where I ask, when did you get the right to be represented by a trade union rep? And people start throwing out the 1800s and stuff and don't realise it's only come through in the 1990s through the Employment Rights Act. This isn't old school stuff, and I think people, with having those extra responsibilities, a lot of trade unions forget that bread and butter trade unionism isn't about sitting there and arguing with an employer over an individual's case. It's that collective organising, and because we've lost that, people tended to have forgotten the power of collective action, and I think that's the big difference between us and the French, that the French seem to remember, because they quite successfully took the head off the snake, quite literally. And I think the ruling class over there remember that quite sort of vividly.
It certainly sharpened the mind, but again, you see capital explaining trade unions as trade unions and any form of collective action as a sort of historical blip. Well, the reality is, forms of collectivism really are the first bit of recorded history. You can go back to Ramses III. You can look at the Deo Medina strikes there. You can go further back to Suma. Actually, this isn't a blip. This is something that is part and parcel of working class nature, and that is in essence what, well, I suppose it would be called what's left old news. It would be something like this. But that's the reason the show's in development as we speak. So more on that as we get there. And in terms of things like equalities as well, there is right now a global sentiment. You have all of the so-called trad wives in the United States, the retraction of Roe v. Wade. You see the attacks on women, as well as our trans brothers and sisters, as well as other equality strands. I mean, we will have some guests who are really at the forefront. I can say from Gibraltar, some of the founders of Gibraltar Pride. We have some interviews lined up with the founder and also the current chair in terms of Pride. So, my question to both would be, why are Pride movements relevant, and why is this a left-wing issue? I suppose.
I think solidarity is always an issue for the left, isn't it? You're not going to get any solidarity from a bunch of people that favour individual rights and freedoms over looking after each other. And it's important, isn't it? I mean, we interviewed Michael Jackson from LGSM, and I think that story sort of encapsulates why solidarity is so important, why marginalised people, we all share a common enemy, and that is usually the ruling class, always the ruling class and the oppressors. And that's the same people oppressing working class people as demonstrated in that story in the film, with the Tory government of Thatcher attacking working people in sort of extremely deprived areas without those industries, at the same time as attacking gay and lesbian people in the media at the time. And yeah, Section 28 and all that sort of stuff, where you're criminalising even speaking about it, you're hiding away people's identity, and that gets very, very macabre very quickly, and it's sort of terrifying, isn't it, to think that a whole generation of children might be forced back into that sort of state of being where they can't even admit who they are.
And we are seeing elements of Section 28 with current rulings on and current interpretations for our trans comrades, you know, and I think it's one of those, isn't it? You know, the weakest link of the chain is our vulnerability, so it's our collective responsibility to ensure that all links in the chain are together. And again, just keeping with the sort of what's left, we haven't got a founding charter or anything like this, so don't be looking for the what's left constitution or anything, but internationalism is an important element of solidarity, global solidarity. And we find that you know, a bus driver in Bolton has more in common with a bus driver in Bangalore than perhaps like Sir Elon Musk. George, you know, in internationalism, why is this a trade union issue? But why do you think perhaps we've forgotten that it is?
Well, so I've you know, I like my sort of trade union music, trade union sort of folk music and things, and they're always talking about these connections between workers around the world, and they're always talking about sort of workers, especially in the United States, who were foreign first language or foreign language only workers. You know, quite a lot of, you know, Finnish and Eastern European miners, which were absolutely treated like expendable. It didn't, you know, safety didn't matter. We'll just hire another worker in if we lose one, and exactly the same conditions are still prevalent. I think one of the ways that they've sort of managed to stave off you know, more in the West is because they've been able to outsource to developing countries some of the jobs with the conditions that are dangerous, that are environmentally damaging, and that is no longer possible. So it's now starting to bite back again. So that's really important. If your employer is going to either outsource your job, if you start to get a bit uppity and form a trade union, outsource your job to somewhere else and exploit a different set of workers. If they're able to outsource your work because we don't dump chemicals into the river, or we don't allow the mining industry to destroy the coastal environment, but that's where they sub it out to developing countries where legislation hasn't caught up to that, or where corruption allows legislation to just be ignored. So it's really important that you know, workers in Britain, in Europe, in the United States recognise this, because the employers don't think on a national scale only. They quite frequently are thinking on a completely global scale. So we need to do.
that was the Jack Welch idea, wasn't it? He was CEO of General Electric, who said if he had to build a new factory or a new plant, he would do so on a barge ready to sail the seven seas if a country imposed workers' right to pay increases. And that idea of flexible labor. I mean, I always think that a global strike, if people are worried about the consequences, a global call-in sick day would truly upend the sort of global order and all of this. And you mentioned as well just some parts there of culture, and that you listen to trade union left-wing songs. I mean, one of the things that I will say to listeners that we will be doing some shows on culture, because it is something that we should be proud of. No, we're not going to be Tom Paulin sat in a Newsnight studio talking broken biscuits about what this song means to me, but actually some interviews with the likes of, I'm not saying we have him scheduled, but Leon Mosselson, for example, and other such singers and authors, to talk about what it is that drives them and why it is that working class culture is important. And well, speaking of authors, I mean, for those of you who've seen my ugly face, you'll know that I'm a published author, but there is also perhaps another book in the mix as well. Sean, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting. I heard you and George talking about the working class history being hidden from us. So again, this project started off as a throwaway, well, not a throwaway post, but a post on social media. So in the ward I represented previously as a councillor, there's a memorial to 14 lifeboatmen who sadly lost their lives going out to save a group of German sailors on the Mexico. The ship was called the Mexico Disaster, it was, and all perished. And I was known about that story, and I think it's 14 working class fishermen usually who hadn't been able to work for quite some time, going out, risking their lives and giving their lives in the end to save people that they didn't know and had never met and would never meet again. And I think that's very telling to see what capitalism and society has done to us, that people back then would have, without a second thought, go out to sea and rescue people. Where now we see people actively criticising the RNLI, attacking them for doing the same thing. And so that spiraled into what I'd noticed was sort of the usual culprits on social media who come on and call me a raving communist and a lunatic or whatever. Didn't do that at that point, and actually it sort of triggered some empathy in people that you sort of think all empathy's gone from. So then that set myself a task of trying to find, research, and write one of these stories every day. That went on for 51 days in the end, to which we've now got them compiled in a list of short stories of sort of solidarity. So yeah, we're waiting to get them illustrated because I think those stories deserve a bit of colour and to be accessible to younger people as well, kids and stuff. But yeah, I think, so it's going to be called Hate Has to Be Taught. This is what we look like without it, stories of solidarity. And hopefully we'll get that off to print later in the year, but I'm sure we can talk about that later. But yeah, it covers all sorts of tales from coastal communities with lifeboats, mining communities with disasters and sort of stories of dispute. George touched on the sort of stuff that happened in Lancashire, the cotton famine, and then the Battle of Bamber Bridge, all the way to stories in Mexico, the Zapatistas and the St. Patrick's Brigades, sort of who crossed the Rio Grande to fight against the American war machine. The 4 Days of Naples is in there. All sorts. It covers every sort of part of what's the best of working class culture. And I think it demonstrates as well that how people react now on social media is not the natural state of being. People have consistently throughout our history given their lives and put their lives on the line for nothing more than wanting to help other people. No one ever expected anything in return from this. And I'm sure George probably knows the quote better, what Abraham Lincoln said about those workers of Lancashire, better than I can pull it off the top of my head, but it was something along the line of saying they were the bravest humans on the planet, probably in much flowery language than than I've repeated. But that's a man who's engaged in the middle of a brutal civil war, who's taken the time to thank workers in Lancashire who would never meet those people who that war was being fought over.
And I would definitely suggest heading to Lincoln Square in Manchester, where you'll find a statue, and actually I believe you'll see a transcript as well. It's been a while since I've been. I mean, it's a good point. We don't think of Abraham Lincoln reaching out to the 98% unemployed cotton workers who were getting their cotton from the slave owning states. Had a devastating impact in Lancashire. George, is any of that impact, I suppose, or any of that story still spoken about in Lancashire?
So there's still photographs up and people that can call back to it. But I think a lot of that history, I think the culture behind it persists, but a lot of that history just falls out of general knowledge, and it was always only taught by us, by our fellow workers teaching each other those things. And as the factories that have transmitted that oral tradition down have gone, so have a lot of those stories fallen out of general knowledge. But also, I think that sort of the way that things are taught. So, if you think back to when I was at primary school and things, and my kids have both just finished, relatively recently finished at primary school, the way that the cotton industry is taught is, let's all go on a day trip to Helmshire Mill and we'll see some weaving and we'll dress up as Victorians. And at sort of nursery school, they'll sing "Wind the Bobbin Up," and it's a really sort of gleeful vision of what it must have been like to work in a mill. Remember that at primary school age, this is the sort of age that you could have been working in a mill, crawling under machines whilst they're still working to pick up, retie broken threads and things. And quite often, children that age were killed, maimed, industrial diseases and things, cotton lung and things. So the way that things are taught is also very important. There are still people when I was growing up who had worked in mills, fully functioning mills before they shut down, and there are still working mills in Darwin. And it's quite interesting to note that most of the people who worked in a mill were deaf. In some cases, not completely deaf, but quite profoundly deaf because of the environment that they worked in for all those years. So it's important that we teach this history, isn't it?
Yeah, and we do see in film and TV the sort of romanticization of times gone by, not perhaps the honest view of what was really going on.
Yeah, it's taught to us as nostalgia, isn't it? It's safe if it's nostalgia. And again, one of the other things I looked at was the suffragettes. And the suffragettes, there's few movements greater than the suffragettes that have been sanded down and polished to be this presentable sort of English, very sort of acceptable form of activism, and completely removing the sort of throwing axes at sitting prime ministers and the arson campaign and the window smashing campaign at Capitol and bombs going off like that. That is completely whitewashed from history. And those incredible women that put their lives on the line and got tortured by the state in prison, it does a massive disservice just whitewashing that out of history. And again, we see that time and time again. This shouldn't be looked back as nostalgia. It should be looked as the blueprint. Because again, if the match women could achieve what they achieved in creating the new union movement as it was, then what excuse do any of us have anywhere? And again, yeah, working class women have been at the forefront of this. I mean, another one I wrote about was Lily Parr, who was a footballer, a lesbian footballer in 1905. She's actually the only footballer with a statue in the National FA's museum. And because she was so good, they had to sort of close the gates on women's football, and that held it back sort of decades and decades and decades, and smothered it out. Because again, men in power don't want to show that maybe everyone can do these sort of things. And it's so depressing to see just how firmly the boot is on our necks of our entire class in this country. And you're right to point that out earlier, Jay, where in this country we don't seem to recognise or know how we solve this. And I would just say it's there. It's throughout history. Workers have always managed to figure this out, and it's always through collectivism that we sort this.
I remember being in the archives in Carlisle and reading about 3 women train drivers. I mean, that was the new one for me, because again, what was going on here. And well, it turns out women had the right to vote in Whitehaven in, I think it was 1858, on the town council. This is long before what we would consider the suffragettes. But anyway, these 3 women, much later on during the time of David Lloyd George, decided to drive a train to launch a few grenades at him, and then casually drove back in the train, and carried on working. It's stories like that whilst for many, we don't advocate violence or anything, but it is stories like that say, well, hold on, if I've been met by violence, the forced intubation of women in prison, and some of the absolute horrors that frankly we would read about in the Second World War occurring within the prisons of and detention centres of the UK. It is high time that we face up to our history, and confront it head on. Never looking too much through the glasses of today, but understand the context of the time is really the way to understand why people undertook the actions that they did.
And I think, Jay, just following on from that, we'd be remiss to not have a quick conversation around what's going on in the United States at the moment, with camps arriving, detention camps, concentration camps, whatever you want to call them, with masked up people who, many of which were Proud Boys, sort of white supremacists, who are now masked up and given a badge saying you're the police, just doing state-sponsored executions in the street, pulling kids from their parents' arms to take off to a camp. And it's disgusting, but also it's heartening to see the American left start to rise and challenge this and protest it, because ICE can't go anywhere without protests happening and people coming out to inform the neighbours. And that sort of solidarity does give us a bit of hope that people aren't just going to roll over and take this, because the mirror between what's happening now across Europe and America, the United States, and 1920s and 30s Germany is so stark and sort of reflective of what was going on. We should be looking out for this a bit more, but we seem to be burying our heads in the sand. And again, back to why it's important that it's a left-wing sort of issue, is we all know on this show that it's the left that are sort of rounded up first. And we see that now with new legislation coming in. Antifa are terrorists now and things like that. And Antifa isn't an organisation. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of living. And I would argue 99% of the planet are anti-fascists, so therefore Antifa. And by sort of criminalising that way of thought, you're trying to shut down the debate before it starts even happening, and trying to, challenge people's free speech, because ironically in the land of free speech, if you're on the left now, you no longer have free speech.
Well, as we talk about, we mentioned the poem, don't we? And if sorry, I'm not giving you any hints. If you're listening to this thinking, what poem? Try harder. Sorry, George.
Yeah, well, I think though as well, I think there is an anti-ICE backlash, and I think an awful lot of it isn't any kind of organised left either. I think quite a lot of it is a genuine outpouring of outrage when you're seeing your fellow citizens being shot in the face for simply challenging ICE officers, and I think there's multiple incidents of that. And then the bit that you called to as well, Sean, that people are sort of masked up. Well, they are masked up. They don't display identification, i.e., badges or collar numbers or anything like that. And it's one of the sort of cornerstones of a legal system, is that nobody is beyond the law. It isn't judge, jury, and executioner. It is people carrying out the duties of the state. It is not a paramilitary force. It is supposed to be a law enforcement agency, and it isn't acting in that way, is it?
Well,
sorry, Jay. I was going to say, I think you're right, George, but the problem is it is a paramilitary force, and it was beforehand. It was, again, the Proud Boys. We saw this start in Charlottesville, didn't we, with the tiki torches quite a few years ago, and that's clearly a continuation of what the KKK were doing. These people have just put the hoods back on in the form of a face mask, and they've been given a badge and gun by an absolute lunatic in charge of the state there, and it's terrifying to see what the future holds for those people, because, again, the only people in that country that aren't immigrants are the people that they're rounding up and putting in. They're the people who've lived on that land for tens of thousands of years. I mean, look at the states in the southwest of America and look at the names. They're not very English sounding. They're not very Boston and New England, are they? It's all Spanish names. So I think there's probably some history they want to look into themselves there.
Well, I remember speaking to an American and saying, I think the explanation, for all of the so-called bad luck the United States is having, it's almost like you've built on top of an ancient American Indian burial ground. Oh, wait, no, that is actually what happened. That was the term that I used, by the way. Native American is the right one. But my only comment with this is the sort of great con, really, which is about these rights and all of this. So the rights or temporary privileges, if they can just be taken from you with the stroke of a pen. And if we want rights, then I tell you, we will achieve nothing on our own, but collectively we can achieve a great many things, and we have done before.
I think there are echoes as well to the past as well in the foreign policy part of the, I don't know what they're going to call it, the war against the left or whatever they're going to title it. But if you look back to, say, McCarthyism, if you look back to the Cold War, if you look back to even things like the war on drugs, which was really about COINTELPRO at home, it was about breaking up the Black Power movements, and abroad it was about stopping the Latin American countries from going communist. And then if you look at the war on terror, which again was about toppling the leadership of countries so that you could exploit the raw resources. Well, this is going to be, and we've already had a prelude to it, this is going to be about the toppling of regimes, the sponsoring of coups, the sponsoring of contras to attack legitimate working class movements and elected governments, isn't it?
I think
just before you come back in, I think that's why it's so important that everyone starts sharing media like this and other media that's talking about these things, because I think very, very quickly you're going to find a drought of any sort of legitimate, independent voices talking about this sort of stuff. So yeah, please do make sure we share our platform and anyone else's, because it's important that these voices get out, and we will be bringing on guests that you'll find sort of a silence on other platforms. But go on, Jay.
I will. Well, my two comments were, I think the war on drugs was a clever way of reinventing slavery and imprisoning Black Americans and getting them to, create all sorts of, free clothing, tech, and what have you, for companies that you will definitely have heard of. And I think, we are really approaching time, but I think just on reflection, history, doesn't repeat itself. History is there to teach lessons. And perhaps one of the reasons it's stamped out now of most education systems is, we shouldn't be reflecting on the horrors of the past to learn from them. Last comments, I suppose, George?
Well, no, it will be very good to get some of the speakers on that Sean mentioned and you mentioned earlier on. I think we've touched on most of those topics individually, so it'll be good to hear it from people who have more first-hand knowledge than we do, or a more broad knowledge than we do. And I think, as we've probably just demonstrated, we could probably talk at length on any one of those subjects, couldn't we?
Well, I might have a reputation in that regard. Sean?
Yeah, again, history is so important. Again, not as nostalgia, but as a blueprint for how we fix this, because one thing working class people are good at when they've got the confidence in themselves to do it is addressing these problems, no matter where they are. We've unfortunately been captured in this bubble of having to buy shit that capital needs to sell us to keep itself in power. We can break that. We can break that very easily. We don't even need to pick up a rifle. If we all just sat on our hands for a couple of days, the system stops spinning and collapses immediately, doesn't it? We all know that inherently. But yeah, and I think it's important now more than ever that we look after each other, because it's going to get dark. Not to sort of be a doomsayer, but I think we're looking at some dark times ahead. But that doesn't mean that we can't overcome this, because again, collectivism and working class people have overcome every struggle throughout history, and we will do it again.
Yeah, and I think that's the way that we end this. I mean, what I just want to say to everyone is, other than the usual, repeating, Sean, please do share these videos. They're available on Spotify, Facebook, and YouTube. Please share if you enjoy. Crucially, please get in touch with us. Our usual email address is what'sleftradio@gmail.com, what'sleftradio@gmail.com. If you've got any guest suggestions or comments, keep it civil, otherwise we might not. And all of this. And yes, I suppose just to conclude, disagreeing with people or having a difference of opinion is one of the cornerstones of a healthy society. Silencing anyone isn't. It's quite often the case these days that the so-called cancel culture is actually not found on the left, but instead on the right. You don't have to agree with that statement either, but there we go. We can have our opinions. What I would like to just say as well, you've just been listening to three white blokes. I absolutely assure you that isn't the way that we'll be continuing. But just some special thanks as well to Billy, Martin and Wheel for providing our bit of a theme tune, really. I've had a number of emails over the years. What is that song? And it's Bridge by Billy Martin and his band Wheel. With the exception of that, thank you to George White and Sean Halsall for joining us this evening. As ever, keep going.